In this video lesson, we will look at the concept of post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is a philosophical and literary movement characterized by challenging or rejecting both the truth value and pragmatic capacity for achieving justice or peace in the modern system of political and economic institutions, as well as the very ways in which we know and act to explain and understand ourselves. Post-structuralists view language not as a stable and reliable tool of communication, but as a fluid, ambiguous domain of complex experience in which ideologies program us without our awareness. So, post-structuralism is both a literary movement as well as a philosophical movement. And from the name itself, you can understand that it is something that comes after structuralism, post-structuralism. And what it does is it is not a complete rejection of structuralism, but rather it looks at structuralism, at the internal contradictions of structuralism, and thinks about how we can take the insights of structuralism further. At a philosophical level, post-structuralism is based on the idea that the modern system of political and economic institutions is not perfect. We are not sure that this system will help us to achieve justice or peace. We are not sure that the concepts behind, the central concepts behind these systems have any truth value. So all these things are either rejected or challenged or questioned by post-structuralism. And it is not just about social, political, or economic institutions. It is not just those that we are challenging in post-structuralism as a philosophical movement, but also the very ways in which we try to understand ourselves. Who are we? What is our position in this world? What kind of agency or what kind of actions are we capable of? All these questions are being the answer to those questions we think that we know are all being challenged by post-structuralism. Now, as far as post-structuralism's notion of language is concerned, post-structuralists consider language to be an unstable and unreliable tool of communication. So we use language for communication. It is a tool for communication, and structuralists consider it to be a very important tool. They think it is a very stable tool. Language works as a structure. And the structure has certain central rules. There are many elements in the structure which are all kept or bound together by these internal rules of the structure, etc., etc. So the structuralist view of language was that it was very stable. However, post-structuralists say that if you take structuralists' insights even further, we realize that actually language is not so stable, it is not so reliable. Instead, it is a fluid, flowing, ambiguous domain. Ambiguous means you don't know whether it is this or that. Rather than language giving us a very clear-cut meanings, instead, it is very ambiguous. So it is a fluid, ambiguous domain of complex experience. So language itself is a kind of experience. It's not just some objective tool that we are using to communicate something very perfectly to another person, but rather language itself is shaped through experiences, through complex experiences. And the way we use language is also shaped historically by our own experiences as well as the experience of all those who have used that language before us. And ultimately, when we use language, what is happening is that there are certain ideologies that are inherent in language, and these ideologies program us even without us being aware of it. നമ്മൾ അറിയാതെ തന്നെ ലാംഗ്വേജിൽ അടങ്ങിയിരിക്കുന്ന ഐഡിയോളജീസ് നമ്മളെ പ്രോഗ്രാം ചെയ്യുന്നു. പ്രോഗ്രാം ചെയ്യുക എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മളെ ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. നമ്മൾ ചെയ്യുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങളെല്ലാം ഒരു രീതിയിൽ പറഞ്ഞാൽ ആ ഐഡിയോളജിക്ക് അനുസരിച്ചാവുന്നു. അത് നമ്മൾ അറിയുന്നു പോലുമില്ല. It is without our awareness. But just by using language in an unquestioning way, we might be perpetrating ideologies. So, that was a simple definition of post-structuralism, and now we look a little more deeply at what are the implications of post-structuralism. So post-structuralism as a movement in philosophy and in critical theory arose in the late 1960s. One of the works that we associate with the rise of post-structuralism is the essay titled Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences that was published in 1966 by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. So Jacques Derrida is one of the key figures who are associated with post-structuralist philosophy and post-structuralist theory. So this particular mode of philosophical inquiry became highly influential in the 1970s. It still retains some influence today, but 1970s was the decade when post-structuralism was at its height. And post-structuralism involves a rigorous critique of structuralism and Saussurian linguistics, which attempted to complement Post-structuralism attempted to complement the shortcomings of structuralism by offering alternative modes of inquiry, explanation, and interpretation. So, the very basis of post-structuralism is a belief that structuralism, which is based on Saussurian linguistics, right? So, that is structural linguistics and structuralism as a theory has a lot of shortcomings, a lot of fault lines, and these have to be complemented, these have to be overcome by offering some alternative modes of interpretation. That is what post-structuralism tries to do. Post-structuralism questions the stability of language as a structure. As we have already mentioned, post-structuralism says that language as a structure is not as stable as it seems. And by extension, it also questions the very concept of structure itself and ultimately of the entire Western philosophical tradition. So language is, according to structuralists, it is the most basic kind of structure and the kind of structurality we see in language. The structure of linguistic sign, which is the relation between a signifier and a signified, all these things are part of structuralist linguistics, and that is something, the structural nature of language, meaning is based on difference, all those things like that, that in some sense shapes structuralism's idea of all other structures. So structuralism basically says that society is a structure, family is a structure, the human society is a structure, the human being is some kind of a structure, the world is a structure. So everything is seen as a structure. But if we say, as post-structuralists do, that language as a structure is by definition unstable, then it means that all other structures are similarly unstable. So the entire Western philosophical tradition, which seems to be this overarching structure, suddenly becomes revealed as just a site of contradictions. Instead of a site of stability, it becomes a site of instability and contradictions. And then if you take it a step forward, if all possible structures, whether social, linguistic, etc., even textual structures, literary texts are considered structures, so those are also unstable. So if you think that conceptual structures, social structures, linguistic structures, and literary textual structures are all unstable, then that means the very concept of a structure is itself unstable. We will look at this in more detail later, but that is a basic idea of post-structuralism. Structuralism works with the idea of a structure. They believe that Structuralists believe that structures are stable and reliable, but post-structuralism tries to reveal the instability and the unreliability of all structures and therefore of the very concept of structure itself. There are many important post-structuralist thinkers like Roland Barthes. He was both a structuralist and a post-structuralist. Then Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, Julia Kristeva, all these are important post-structuralist thinkers. But post-structuralism in some sense is primarily associated with a figure named Jacques Derrida. As I already mentioned, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who brought about the idea of something called deconstruction. So deconstructivist theory or deconstructivist criticism was the major contribution of the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and deconstruction is a very important aspect of post-structuralism. In another video, in the next video, we will look at deconstruction in much more detail. But for now, we will look at how post-structuralism becomes a critique of structuralism. So we already mentioned that post-structuralism comes forth with a critique of structuralism. It shows what are the problems with structuralism. Let us look at that in slightly more detail. Structuralism is based on the idea of coherent structures consisting of disparate elements held together by a center. And the center supposedly organizes and regulates the structure, yet itself escapes structurality. So this is the basic idea of structuralism, that there is everything is a structure. So there are many different structures. You can read anything as a structure, including a literary text, including social structure like the nation, like the family, etc. And what is a structure? A structure is something that is very coherent. It is composed of several elements, different elements, disparate elements. But how do all these elements combine together and form a coherent structure? That is because all these different elements are held together by a center or a central idea or a central rule. So, for example, if you look at the literary text, there are many elements including the words, the different meanings, the denotations or the connotations of those words. There are characters, themes, all sorts of things. These can all be considered different elements of that particular literary text. But that text is held together by a particular center, which according to traditional critics, that what holds the text together. The center is something that you can consider the meaning of the text. Okay, so the meaning of that text according to traditional critics is based on the author's intention. According to new critics, it is based on something about the text itself, the words in the text itself, etc., etc. So there will be different ways of understanding what exactly that center is, but all these different ways of analyzing the text look at the text as having a central meaning. So structuralism would say that the text is a structure of disparate elements which are held together by a center, which is the meaning of that text. Now this center is what organizes and regulates the structure. ഈ സ്ട്രക്ചറിനെ, ഈ എലിമെൻറ്റ്സ് എല്ലാം ഈ സ്ട്രക്ചറിൽ എവിടെ കിടക്കണമെന്ന് തീരുമാനിക്കുന്നതും അതിനെ റെഗുലേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതും ഈ എലിമെൻറ്റ്സ് ആ സ്ട്രക്ചറിൽ നിന്ന് എസ്കേപ്പ് ചെയ്തു പോവാതെ നോക്കുന്നതും എല്ലാം ആ സെൻറ്ററാണ്. ബട്ട് ദാറ്റ് സെൻറ്റർ ഇറ്റ് സെൽഫ് എസ്കേപ്പ് സ്ട്രക്ചറാലിറ്റി. ദാറ്റ് മീൻസ് ദാറ്റ് സെൻറ്റർ ഹവെവർ ഇസ് നോട്ട് റൂൾഡ് ബൈ എനി ഓഫ് ദി എലിമെൻറ്റ്സ്. ആ സ്ട്രക്ചറിനകത്താണ് സെൻറ്റർ എങ്കിലും ഒരു രീതി പറഞ്ഞാൽ സ്ട്രക്ചറിന് പുറത്താണ്. Because nothing within that structure will actually rule that center. So somehow, for example, if you say that the author's intention is the central element that gives meaning to the text, then the author is somebody who stands outside the text. The text is there, all the different elements of the text exist there, but the author stands outside the text. So there is always this idea that the central element pre-exists the text. ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടാവുന്നതിന് മുമ്പ് ഓതർ ഉണ്ട്. ഓതറാണ് ടെക്സ്റ്റിനെ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയത്. പ്രീ എക്സിസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതാണ് ഓതർ. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ the idea that the author stands outside the text and regulates the text, but he himself is not affected or regulated by the text. So this is one example of how the notion of structure with the center works in structuralism. Let us look at one more example. let us look at the idea of ethics. Ethics means the difference between good and evil. What are the things that we should do? What are the things we should not do? All those things. But what determines ethics? So ethics can be considered a certain kind of structure. Our idea of human beings, idea of ethics. What are our rights and duties? What are the things that we should do and we should not do? What is right and wrong? What is good and evil? What is a sin and what is a virtue? All these are structured by a certain idea of ethics. But what determines ethics? In olden times or in religious societies, people say that God is the center of an ethical system. God determines what is right and what is wrong. Later, people came up with other ideas like reason, humanity, then liberty, equality, fraternity, all kinds of ideas came. So the center doesn't remain the same, it can change over time. But what is common to all these things? Whether you say that God determines what is good and evil, or you say that humanity determines what is good and evil, the structure is ultimately the same. There is an idea of good and evil, and there are many elements that cohere in this particular structure of ethics, and it is determined by something called God or something called humanity, both of which are outside this system. So if you say that God determines what is good and evil, then you cannot use the same concept of good and evil to question God. You cannot use that to regulate God. God is outside and God precedes the system. ദൈവമാണ് ഈ കോൺസെപ്റ്റുകൾ ഗുഡ് ഈവിൾ എന്നുള്ള കോൺസെപ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടാക്കിയതെങ്കിൽ ഈ ഗുഡ് ആൻഡ് ഈവിൾ എന്നുള്ള കോൺസെപ്റ്റ് ദൈവത്തിന് അപ്ലൈ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റില്ല. ഇനി ഗോഡ് എന്നുള്ള ഐഡിയ മാറ്റി ഹ്യൂമാനിറ്റി എന്നുള്ള ഐഡിയ ആണ് നമ്മൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നെങ്കിൽ ദെൻ nowadays we talk about human rights etc. Then even then there is the idea is that the concept of humanity precedes the concepts of good and evil. ഹ്യൂമാനിറ്റി എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സാധനം ആദ്യമേ ഉണ്ട്. അതിൻ്റെ ബേസിസിലാണ് നമ്മൾ നല്ലത് ചീത്ത എന്ന് നമ്മൾ തരംതിരിക്കുന്നത്. വിച്ച് അഗെയിൻ മീൻസ് ദാറ്റ് വട്ട് എവർ ഇസ് ഹ്യൂമാനിറ്റേറിയൻ, വട്ട് എവർ ഇസ് in that domain of humanity cannot be questioned. That cannot be regulated by the concepts of good and evil. Rather, humanity becomes the thing which determines what is good and what is evil. Another example in political science can be the concept of democracy. So nowadays we take democracy so much for granted and we think that that is the best form of government, but it was not historically always so. But let us think of it this way. Every time in politics, when we say that something is progressive or not progressive, we always tend to think of whether it is democratic or not. So the idea is that democracy is the center that regulates this idea of politics. But the question, a political question like is this progressive or not, is this politically expedient or not, none of those things actually affect the very concept of democracy. So we are not questioning the concept of democracy itself. We think that democracy stands outside all such possible questionings and it regulates politics as it exists today. So these, I have given you three ideas, three examples: God, humanity and democracy. These are all examples of centers, central elements that regulate a structure, but which are considered as preceding the structure, standing outside the structure and not being constrained by the rules of that structure. Now, post-structuralism questions the very coherence of such structures. It questions the very nature of a center and it asks how is it possible that a center can be both inside and outside a structure. If a center is outside the structure, completely outside the structure, then how can it control all the elements of that structure? If it controls all the elements of that structure, then it must be inside or it must be part of that structure. And if it is part of that structure, then it must be controlled by either some elements within the structure or something outside the structure. If it is controlled by something inside the structure, then it is no longer a center, because center is what controls everything else. If it is controlled by something outside the structure, then it is no longer it is no longer a center, but rather it is an element whose center is somewhere outside. So then, if you say that the center of this particular system is controlled by something outside, then that something outside becomes the new center. And the very concept of structure itself expands. So നമ്മൾ സ്ട്രക്ചർ എന്ന് വിചാരിച്ച സാധനമല്ല സ്ട്രക്ചർ, അതിൻ്റെ സെൻറ്റർ അല്ല, പകരം ഒറിജിനൽ സെൻറ്റർ, ഈ സെൻറ്ററിനെയും കൺട്രോൾ ചെയ്യുന്ന സെൻറ്റർ പുറത്തെവിടെയോ ആണ് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ ഒരു സ്ട്രക്ചർ, ഒരു സെൽഫ് കണ്ടെയ്ൻ സ്ട്രക്ചർ എന്ന് വിചാരിച്ച ആ ഒരു സാധനം ഒരു ലാർജർ സ്ട്രക്ചറിൻ്റെ ഭാഗം മാത്രമാണെന്ന് നമ്മൾ മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നു. സോ ദിസ് questioning of the center, this displacing of the center from the centrality that has been given to it so far is called decentering. സെൻറ്ററിനെ ആ സെൻറ്റർ എന്നുള്ള സ്ഥാനത്ത് നിന്ന് മാറ്റുക, സെൻറ്റർ എന്ന നമ്മൾ വിചാരിച്ചിരുന്ന എലിമെൻറ്റിനെ ആ സെൻട്രൽ പൊസിഷനിൽ നിന്ന് എടുത്ത് മാറ്റുക, മറ്റെങ്ങോട്ടോ മാറ്റുക. ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് കോൾഡ് ഡീസെൻറ്ററിങ്. Now, another aspect of post-structuralism's critique of structuralism is, of course, the critique of Saussurian linguistics or structuralist linguistics. Let's see very briefly how this goes. According to Saussure, the linguistic sign is the relation between a signifier and a signified. Signifier, as you know, means a word. It is the set of letters or the set of sounds that combine together to form a word, which is a signifier. It signifies something. എന്തിനെയോ signify ചെയ്യുന്ന സാധനം, അതാണ് signifier. And then what does it signify? That is the signified. It refers to a concept. എന്തിനെയാണോ നമ്മൾ signify ചെയ്യുന്നത്, that is the signified. So the relation between signifier and signified is called linguistic sign according to Saussure, and this is the space where meaning is produced. So what we normally call meaning is basically just this relation between a signifier and a signified, and he says that this relation is an arbitrary one. Meaning is not inherent to any particular word, but rather it is arbitrarily decided by society, and also the meaning of every word is based on the difference between that word and many other words. So meaning is based on difference. These are some important elements of Saussurian linguistics. According to post-structuralists, a signified is never complete in itself, but rather leads to another signified, and so on. Which is to say that if you take a word like tree, and that is a signifier. What is a signified? The actual tree that you see somewhere, or the concept of a tree. It's not the physical tree, but rather the concept of a tree. So you have a signifier and a signified. But then if you think a little further, the very concept of a tree is based on so many other things. First of all, it is based on many other kinds of trees, many other things that you can do with trees, the many connotative meanings of trees. A tree is something that gives you shade, a tree is nature, a tree is God, a tree can be cut down and used to make furniture, a tree gives you fruit. So there are so many different meanings. The moment you think of tree, the concept tree doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't exist by itself, but rather that concept leads you to so many different concepts. So ultimately you never reach the final meaning. The moment you think of any signifier, you think of a signified, a concept, and then that signified leads you to another concept or signified, which leads you to another set of concepts or signified. It is almost like you are in Wikipedia, and you know this hyperlink system where you go and search for the meaning of one term, and then you see many other hyperlinks, so you go and click on that, and that takes you to a different page. And then there are many other hyperlinks, so you click and you read somewhere altogether, right? That is what we do when we work with a hyperlinked page like we do in Wikipedia. So that is in some sense a very material illustration of the post-structuralist critique of Saussurian linguistics. So each signifier becomes a each signified becomes a signifier in a chain of signifiers and signifieds. Thus, signification as a process never ends. അപ്പോൾ സ്ട്രക്ചറലിസ്റ്റുകൾ വിചാരിച്ചെന്താ വെച്ചാൽ ഒരു സിഗ്നിഫയറും ഒരു സിഗ്നിഫൈഡും തമ്മിലുള്ള റിലേഷൻ ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റിക് സൈൻ ഉണ്ടാവുന്നതോടുകൂടി സിഗ്നിഫിക്കേഷൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ മീനിങ് മേക്കിംഗ് പ്രോസസ്സ് അതോടുകൂടി തീർന്നു. ഒരു സിഗ്നിഫയറും ഒരു സിഗ്നിഫൈഡിനെയും കൂടി ലിങ്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നതോടുകൂടി മീനിങ് ഉണ്ടായി എന്നാണ് സ്ട്രക്ചറലിസ്റ്റുകൾ വിചാരിച്ചിരുന്നത്, സോഷ്യോറിയൻ ലിംഗ്വിസ്റ്റുകൾ വിചാരിച്ചിരുന്നത്. പക്ഷേ പോസ്റ്റ് സ്ട്രക്ചറലിസ്റ്റ് ഐഡിയ അനുസരിച്ച് നോക്കിക്കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു സിഗ്നിഫയർ ഒരു സിഗ്നിഫൈഡ് പിന്നെയും ഒരു signified becomes a signifier which leads to another signified. That second signified becomes a signifier leading you to a third signified. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ചെയിൻ ഓഫ് സിഗ്നിഫയേഴ്സ് ആൻഡ് സിഗ്നിഫൈഡ്സ് ഇൻ്റർട്വൈൻഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള, നമുക്ക് സിഗ്നിഫയറും സിഗ്നിഫൈഡും തമ്മിലുള്ള വ്യത്യാസം പോലും മനസ്സിലാകാൻ പറ്റാത്ത അത്രയും വലിയൊരു ഫ്ലോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ചെയിൻ ഓഫ് സിഗ്നിഫയേഴ്സ് ആൻഡ് സിഗ്നിഫൈഡ്സ് ഉണ്ടായി വരികയാണ്. അതിലെ ഒരു അംശം മാത്രമാണ് ഓരോ സിഗ്നിഫൈഡും. സോ അങ്ങനെ നോക്കുമ്പോൾ മീനിങ് എവിടെ നിൽക്കുന്നു? മീനിങ് നിൽക്കുന്നില്ല. Signification as a process never ends, never stops. And therefore, post-structuralists say that the meaning of a word is never complete, but rather it is endlessly postponed or deferred. We will refer to this in more detail when we talk about deconstruction, but there is this idea that the meaning is based not just on this relation, arbitrary and differential relation between a signifier and signified, but the meaning of a word is never complete. നമ്മൾ എത്ര ഇതാണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാലും നമുക്കൊരിക്കലും ആ വേർഡിൻ്റെ ഫുൾ മീനിങ് നമുക്ക് കിട്ടില്ല. ദാറ്റ് മീനിങ് ഇസ് ഓൾവേസ് പോസ്റ്റ്പോൺഡ്. Another example I will give you, if you want to look up the meaning of a word in a dictionary, it will lead you to more words, right? So you never reach the actual thing. Rather, if you look up the meaning of one word in a dictionary, it may give you a definition that is composed of 10 words. Then if you start looking at the meaning of each of those words, it will lead you to even more and more words. So the number of words increases the more you conduct this inquiry, the more you take this inquiry forward, but you never completely grasp the meaning. This is a more simplistic way of saying that the meaning of the word is never completely reached. So I hope this concept is clear. It is not just that on the one hand the meaning of a word will lead you to many other words. On the other hand, if the meaning of a word will lead you to a concept which will lead you to many other concepts. So the more you use language, the more concepts you are creating. But none of these concepts have full meaning because they are always in relation to some other concepts. And ultimately, no word ever has a complete meaning. We are never able to reach the final meaning. Now we will end this particular video with an analysis of some of the features of post-structuralism. And as I mentioned at the bottom of this slide, these particular features are taken from a glossary of literary theory by M.H. Abrams. Different works, different theoretical works or reference books might give you slightly different ideas. So this you don't have to look at these exact 5 elements as the features of post-structuralism, but I think this will give you a good idea of what are some of the features of post-structuralism. So Abrams lists 5 features of post-structuralism. The first one is the primacy of theory, which means that earlier there was always an importance given to theory in Western philosophy especially, but theory was always something like, it was always qualified as scientific theory, literary theory, etc. But here theory is used without qualifiers. Theory becomes just the noun theory is taken by itself without any qualifiers, any adjectives like scientific or literary, and theory becomes central to analyzing all kinds of signifying systems with a view to questioning or challenging their dominant meanings. So not just linguistic systems, not just literary systems, but all kinds of systems, all kinds of texts are understood as being signifying systems. Everything has some meaning. Everything is a meaning making process. And of course that meaning Whether we can reach that meaning or not is a different question, but everything that we do, including our behavior, the way we talk, the way we dress, all these are signifying systems, and we need something called theory in order to analyze all these systems, to question or challenge the dominant meaning. What seems like the meaning is not the real meaning. Adine challenge cheyanam, and we should try and bring out the real underlying meaning or underlying set of meanings. So for that reason, we need theory. So the primacy of theory is one of the important features of post-structuralism according to M.H. Abrams. The second feature is the decentering of the subject. I have already explained what is decentering. Now here what it means that philosophically speaking, the idea of the primacy and agency of the human subject is questioned. So in traditional Western philosophy, the human being, in philosophy as well as in theology, the human being is given a privileged position. The other animals, nature and everything else, non-living beings, objects in nature, everything is somehow secondary and less important than human beings. That is how traditionally we thought about the relation between human beings, or the position of human beings in relation to other objects and things in the world. But that primacy is questioned by post-structuralist philosophy. Also, in how does this relate to literature, to literary criticism? Post-structural literary criticism questions the primacy and agency of the author. That means the author is not the most important person anymore, and whether the author intended anything at all, that is completely questioned. So, if you must be aware of the idea of death of the author that was proposed by Roland Barthes, who started out as a structuralist thinker but later became associated with certain elements of post-structuralism as well. So the very idea of death of the author says that there is no person, there is no subject called author who has all the intention and who creates this text, but rather the author is a kind of empty space into which his experiences and many other things combine to create this output which we see, which is called a text. So the decentering of the subject refers to the questioning of the primacy and agency of the human subject in general and the author in particular. But when the author is questioned or challenged, then the concept of the reader should also be challenged, because it is not like the author now has no meaning and the reader can bring in any meaning that they like. Even that would imply that the reader is a unified subject, but that is also questioned by post-structuralism, and this goes on to the this takes us to the third feature of post-structuralism, which is the importance of reading, text and writing. So the notion of purposeful authors and purposeful readers give way to an incessant process of reading indeterminate text. So the text comes to the fore in post-structural criticism, but this is not in the same way that the text comes to the fore in new criticism. In new criticism, we still think that the text has some kind of a wholeness, and the text will provide meaning by itself. You don't have to go outside the text, you just look at the text and the text will provide you with the meaning. So in new criticism, the text also had a certain primacy that is taken away in post-structuralism by looking at the text as an indeterminate object. The indeterminate means meaning of the text cannot be determined. നമുക്ക് ഒരിക്കലും കണ്ടുപിടിക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്തതാണ് മീനിങ്, ഇന്നതാണ് മീനിങ് എന്ന് നമുക്ക് കൃത്യമായി പറയാൻ പറ്റില്ല. When we study deconstruction, we will look at this in a bit more detail. That text seem to have one central meaning, but if you look closer you will realize that there are many fault lines in that text that reveal contradictory meanings. So texts are indeterminate, and therefore the process of reading that text is incessant. It will never end. The fourth concept is the concept of discourse. That is a fourth feature of post-structuralism. The concept of individual autonomous text is replaced by that of discourse, and discourse here refers to an amorphous body of text. Amorphous means constantly changing shape. It is not fixed, it is indeterminate and it is amorphous. So discourse refers to an amorphous body of text of which the individual texts just make up one element. So any individual text that you study, you cannot study it alone. You have to study it in the context of several other texts. And these could be visual text, verbal text, literary, non-literary text, social text, behavioral text, etc. So you can never, the boundary of a text never ends. And that is why now, instead of talking about analyzing texts, post-structuralists talk about analyzing discourses. So discourse refers to a set of texts, but they are not necessarily only literary texts, they are all kinds of texts. And it is not a proper structure of text, but rather it is an ever-changing, amorphous, indeterminate body of text. You can keep adding to that body of text, or you can take things away from that. So basically, discourse is again something that never ends. And the fifth and final feature that Abrams mentions of post-structuralism is what he calls a hermeneutics of suspicion. Hermeneutics refers to the science of interpretation, the study of interpretation. So how do we interpret these texts according to a post-structuralist critical method? You have to use a hermeneutics of suspicion, which means that since no text means exactly what it says, so we have said that there is a dominant meaning, the text seems to be saying something, there is an apparent meaning, but that is not the real meaning of that text. If no text means what it says, then you have to find out, you have to go beyond what it says, you have to read between the lines and find out what is the real meaning of a text. Now, this is done in different ways. Many post-structural critics try to approach the text with suspicion in order to bring out the hidden meanings and ideologies within these texts. So one way of looking at it is that this text has a dominant ideology. This text has a particular, it is telling a particular story, or it seems to have a particular theme. But if you go deeper, you will find that there is a hidden ideology or a hidden meaning which we don't understand, but which shapes us. These ideologies program us without our awareness, as we mentioned in the beginning of this discussion. So one way is to say that the text seems to be saying one thing, but the real meaning, the real ideology is hidden, and we need to approach the text with suspicion in order to bring out that hidden ideology. This is one way of approaching a text. Another way which the deconstructivist post-structural critics do is to say that there is no one meaning to a text. The text is indeterminate, so you cannot say that there is any one particular meaning. At surface level, it may look like this is the meaning of the text, but if you explore the text further, you can find out hundreds of contradictory meanings. And if you place all these meanings together, then you get some idea of the text. So you never reach the final meaning of a text. All you can see is this play of contradictory or indeterminate meanings within a text. So these are different ways in which you approach the text with a hermeneutics of suspicion to dismantle the apparent meanings of that text and reveal either the hidden meaning or a set of contradictory meanings pointing to the fault lines within those texts. So we will stop this discussion of post-structuralism for now. Here I have given a few references that you can look up to learn more about post-structuralism and deconstruction. And in the next video, we will look at the concept of deconstruction in philosophy and in literature, both as a philosophical system and as a method in a bit more detail. Thank you.